Well, this year has been extremely challenging for the Middle East as it has been for the rest of the world. In the Middle East in particular, the COVID crisis has served to expose but also accelerate many of the adverse trends that have afflicted the region in recent times. Conflicts have not abated. Regional competition is as complex and as intense as it has been. Real questions about the future of governance when low prices are low, when state capacity has been eroded. And of course, there's the big question of the future of US policy towards the region. So if we want to look at the regional security challenges, I think the first one is to recognize that regional competition is a lot more complex. So there are broadly two rivalries in the Middle East that are worth noting. The first one is between Saudi Arabia and Iran, one that is well known and has a global impact. And here the question is, after years of escalation and brushes with all-out conflict, will 2021 open a phase of diplomacy around Iran's nuclear program, around regional activities, but also, a possible progress towards a regional security architecture that, contains but also reassures Iran. The other rivalry worth noting is the one between the UAE and Turkey, which is as deep as potent as the first one right now. And this is a rivalry that is about ideology, influence, and territory across the Middle East. It plays out in Libya, it plays out in the Eastern Mediterranean, and a bit everywhere else. And so that's another rivalry that, while not necessarily containing the prospect of a direct conflict, still shapes the attitudes of the various players. So as 2020 ends, the big question is whether there are strategies or perhaps a regional forum that can bring together all these actors to discuss a regional de-escalation, something that of course would start with bilateral moves but would need to be inscribed in a broader context, or whether this competition is destined to grow and intensify. I tend to be pessimistic in this regard. I still don't think that the mindsets are there for a genuine de-escalation, but much will depend on US policy. What we've seen in the past few years is a US policy that is disengaged and sometimes cultivates the worst instincts of local actors. But there's also the possibility that US policy will be a bit more constructive, even as the US downsizes its role in the region, where it can actually help the parties to negotiate in good faith towards a de-escalation. As everywhere else, the COVID pandemic is going to have first and foremost an impact on the economic situation and the social cohesion of these countries. So it will take some time to play out. What is certainly true is that things have not gotten better for Middle Eastern states. They've actually gotten worse. In every country in the region, economic growth is at a standstill. There is massive social pain. All the problems that existed before are worse. And there has been no integrated regional approach to deal with that. So the security and political impacts are not going to be immediate. They will take time to unfold. But it's likely that governments will realize that actually they have fewer resources to address the fundamental grievances of societies. Now, much will depend on how seriously governments take the responsibility to start the recovery, not just an economic but also social recovery. Some countries have resources to do so, especially the Gulf states. Others are in much worse place. I mean, countries like Syria and Yemen, which are war-torn countries, are struggling with massive outbreak of infections and pretty high caseloads. One can look at this and say, well, situation was bad, so it's just getting a bit worse. In reality, the inability of states to provide health services is, at the core of the grievances of citizens across the region. Jobs, healthcare, other type of services. So one should expect that, as Middle Eastern states struggle with the economic and social impact, there will be more turmoil, there will be more popular discontent. Well, as expected, the weaker countries in the region were less prepared to deal with the pandemic. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were more exposed and more vulnerable. The Gulf states, which are rich and globally integrated countries, actually took a very hard hit early on, precisely because they were open, because they were reliant on tourism and travel, and because there was lots of movement in society. And they suffered quite significantly early on, but they were able to build the systems to deal with the crisis, and they've done relatively well from a human and health perspective. It's countries like Syria and Yemen, but also Lebanon and Iraq that need to be looked at. Syria and Yemen are countries at war, and the caseloads are massive there. It's an overlooked tragedy at the moment, but they don't have the material, the staff, the resources, or the infrastructure to deal with the pandemic as needed. The governments there also prefer to wish the pandemic away. We saw them try to understate or ignore the scope of the crisis altogether, because it's easier to do that than face their population and say, we can't, or we're not up to the task, we can't deal with it. We saw this particularly in Syria, but also in Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen. Lebanon and Iraq are a different story. They were already struggling before the pandemic, and so when the pandemic hit, it exacerbated their economic and social challenges. The pandemic also contributed to deflating the protest movements that were there. The necessity to go home and wear masks and so on really eroded the appeal of the revolutionary movements that had taken the streets in Baghdad and Beirut. And that created some room for the political elite to come back and reassert itself. And in both countries, what we saw since the pandemic is that the political class is back in the game because they control the resources of the state. They are able to communicate and to the broader public offer the kind of help that's needed. So really, it depended on a number of factors, and it's not clear today, who comes on top and who doesn't.